Hey guys, Stanley C here. I just got off of my call with Jake Newby of Concrete Avalanche. A fantastic conversation. I can't wait to share it with you. And I want to do this intro to let you know more about Jake and kind of what our conversation was about. So here it is. In today's era of East-West digital tensions, Jake Newby's writing is more important than ever. The founder and author of the Substack Concrete Avalanche, Jake discusses and shares alternative Chinese music with audiences around the world. Sustaining nearly 3,000 followers and being awarded the prestigious Substack Featured Publication badge, Jake is successfully creating a bridge between massively different cultures. Jake's writing accomplishments date back far before his time in Substack, however. In the early aughts, right out of college, he decided to move to China to teach English as part of a government program. From there, he stayed in China and developed a reputation as a great team builder, effective editor, and exceptional Mandarin speaker. Not before long, he became editor of several local publications, including Radii and Time-Out Shanghai. Jake has also interviewed a number of A-list celebrities throughout his career, from Justin Bieber to Kanye West and Keith Richards. And I can't wait for you to hear his Kanye story in our interview. Jake's work has also been in renowned publications like the Financial Times, Vogue, The Wire, and the Associated Press. In our enriching conversation, we break down some of the misunderstandings about music in China, what it's like to build a writing career and gain legitimacy from large and small publications, and so much more. Jake was wonderful to talk to and exuded incredible modesty despite his enormous accomplishments. For any aspiring music journalist, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Enjoy. Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to the If Ever You're Listening podcast. I'm your host, Stanley C. And today we have a fantastic host, co-host. It always feels like a co-host, but a fantastic guest, Jake Newby of Concrete Avalanche, the Substack on the great newsletter on Substack that focuses a lot about Chinese music, but specifically like Chinese alternative, Chinese indie music. And today we're going to talk more about his experience as a writer, his experience living in China, the background to his career. I have a lot of China questions because, as some of you know, I lived there for a little bit, and hopefully some tangents that we can't expect, we can't predict. So thank you, Jake, for being here. How has your day been so far?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Stanley, first of all, and thank you for that great introduction. Yeah, my day's been pretty good. It's been pretty chill, to be honest. I mean, by quite literally, it's quite cold. I'm in the UK at the moment. It's pretty cold here, hence I'm wearing a woolly hat. But yeah, I'm actually preparing to go to China in a few days. I'm going back for New Year, for the Lunar New Year. So yeah, today's been pretty chill. Just trying to catch up on a few things. Caught up with my mum, just to sort of say goodbye before heading off for a couple of weeks. But yeah, it's been quite a nice chill weekend so far.
No, that's good. I'm sorry it's so cold. It's cold right now in New Jersey, but not cold enough where I have to wear a hat indoors. That's a sign.
I
Things are
mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's winter, it's Britain, it's expected to be honest. I mean, the coldness is expected. It's probably not so cold that I have to wear a hat indoors, but I try and keep the heating down and help for the environment, all that kind of stuff. So I tend to wear more if I can. And probably a hangover from China a little bit as well. I feel like
yeah.
Chinese people are pretty good at just layering up even indoors,
Mhm.
rather than always cranking the heating up necessarily or turning the aircon on. So yeah.
So you mentioned this is actually great that we're starting the conversation about where you are right now because you are where you are from. You're from England, and some background. When I was in college, I studied abroad in like the Ormskirk outside of Liverpool area. So I know more about like that middle region of England. But let me know, where are you from in England, and kind of how was it growing up in England, and when did your love for music and for writing actually begin?
So I'm speaking to you now from southwest of England. So this is an area called the Cotswolds, which is a really beautiful part of the world. Feel very fortunate to have sort of grown up, not quite where I am right now, but in this kind of area in the southwest of England. I'm actually currently in a small town called Stroud, which is it's a really great little town. It's quite a small kind of Cotswoldy kind of town, but it has a really vibrant art scene and a real kind of like arts kind of heritage, like a strong kind of like arts heritage as well. There's a bunch of like great bands and artists and stuff who are kind of either from here or who are based around here. Um, and so yeah, it's a town that really sort of punches above its weight in terms of the arts, and that's one of the things that I love about it. But yeah, I grew up in southwest of England, so fairly nearby to here. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think I got into music when I mean, properly into music, probably when I was in secondary school. I mean, maybe a little bit from my parents. Like there was always like a very solid kind of like vinyl collection in the lounge. Like, it was all kind of there on the wall. Like there was like shelves of records and my parents had grown up in an era when they were picking up records, original copies of records by the Beatles and the Stones and stuff like that. So, I mean, a few dodgy records in there as well, probably, but there was some very good records to sort of pick out. But I think, I don't know, it was probably through friends and the sort of people that I was hanging out with, maybe a little bit through my brother as well. So I have an older brother, um, and certainly like when he was a sort of at the age where he could drive, for example, he would like drive us into school, and he would make sure that there was music blaring like for the journey in. So I grew up in a kind of small village, and then the school was in like a sort of nearby town. So there was always a school run. And yeah, it would either my brother would be blasting music, or I'd be getting on a school bus, and the school bus kind of used to like wind its way around the town that the school was in. And I found that if I timed it right, I could get off at the bottom of the town, run into a shop, and buy like a CD, or buy like the latest copy of The NME or
Mhm.
something like that, like a music magazine or a newspaper or something, and run up the hill to the top of town and get back on the bus, and then somebody on the bus would usually have a CD player, like a CD Walkman or something, and we'd all sort of, share the headphones around or whatever, and try and listen to Elliott Smith or whatever it was that I sort of grabbed off the shelf, or yeah, just kind of pour over the enemy or whatever the kind of magazine was at the time. So yeah, like I don't know really. There's not like a sort of singular moment that I particularly remember, but I know music was always kind of present, I suppose, in my life, and it was always around, and I was very fortunate in that regard. Um, and writing, like, I mean, yeah, gosh, I don't know. I always enjoyed writing, even from when I was a small child, just, writing kind of little stories and stuff in primary school, things like that. I always enjoyed the sort of craft of writing and the idea of producing something like that. But yeah, I mean, I got more into sort of writing about, I guess, like nonfiction writing, as it were, probably more sort of in university around that sort of time. I took a fairly writing heavy kind of degree, and I kind of started to think about writing for like the university newspaper and things like that. But yeah, again, probably not like a sort of singular moment. It feels like something that, yeah, I always sort of enjoyed putting pen to paper or tapping away on a keyboard.
No, that's fascinating. And thank you for sharing that, Jake, because I think those moments, as little as they may seem at the time, are so foundational to our understanding of our relationship to music. Like making the conscious choice to leave the bus to go to the music store to get the NME, get the Elliott Smith CD, and then going back to like that type of just small actions, that shows kind of how committed you were at the time too, which I found really, really cool. And so when you went to college and you started taking writing courses, what made you take writing over business or law or politics? Like why did you want to major in that?
Yeah, so to be honest, it wasn't exactly a writing degree. So my degree was in politics and sociology. So it wasn't writing focused in that sense. It was more that there was a lot of writing involved in it, if you know what I
Mhm.
mean. So it was less of a sort of practical kind of degree, something that could have really probably benefited the world. And it was more just like a lot more kind of like theoretical kind of stuff. But obviously, essay writing was a huge part of it.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, obviously academic writing, that kind of writing was is very different to, I mean, a lot of the sort of stuff that I do now. But I definitely liked it gave me an interest in kind of like crafting sentences and
Mhm.
I mean, I guess, also important things like sourcing your work and quotes and all of that kind of stuff. But I think probably like piecing together like an argument almost,
Mhm.
which is, a pretty key part of writing an essay in politics and sociology. I really enjoyed that process and actually quite, liked editing my own work and all of that kind of stuff. And I guess those skills kind of just stayed with me, and that interest stayed with me. And so I was always looking to um, go into a field where I could be writing, when it came to sort of finding work and things, if I could be something which was sort of based around writing as much as possible.
And when you left university, what type of work did you find yourself doing? And because you've written for some really, really cool publications, like Time Out Shanghai and others and Radii. What were those first couple years out of college like, in terms of working with publications, working with different newspapers, and how did you find yourself in those spaces early on?
So I went straight from university to China, effectively. So I basically graduated, and yeah, a couple of months later, probably I was on a plane to Shanghai. So initially, what I was doing was teaching English, actually. So I went with the British Council, and the British Council at the time, and I think still today, they send people all over the world to go and teach English. Um, and I kind of stumbled across their program, and certainly stumbled across their program in China. I'd never been to Asia before. I had no plan to go to China particularly, but I ended up on that program. Ended up in Shanghai, and I was teaching at like a middle school over there. And so that was like my first year in China, basically. But I had enough time probably on the side to explore other areas, and so I kind of started writing for a few different publications. Some of them, I mean, one of them in particular was Shanghaiist, which was the Shanghai outpost of the Gothamist blog, which used to be based in New York. Um, and yeah, I mean, I just kind of started, honestly, by just approaching people. And I think, I mean, the English language media community was fairly small at that time. Shanghai's a massive city. Um, there's a lot of publications there, but the English language world, especially when I was first there, was a little bit was significantly smaller, obviously, than the Chinese language one. And yeah, I think I just sort of started emailing people probably and just trying my luck a little bit. And then yeah, picking up names like Time Out. So actually, Time Out was the sort of first proper full time writing job that I had effectively. Like I'd worked for one other magazine for a short while just before that, which was a sort of Time Out like listings kind of magazine about the city.
Mhm.
And then Time Out launched an English version in Shanghai in 2010, and they approached me and asked me if or well, I approached them, and yeah, there was a bit of back and forth, but basically I ended up being lucky enough to write their kind of music and nightlife sections. And so to be honest, like some of it was probably it's just good fortune and luck and being in the right place at the right time. And I think um, around about that sort of time as well, there was like a real interest in China, I think, from in the English language media world. Um, and so, to be honest with you, it was always quite a niche subject. The sort of alternative music scene in China was always a fairly niche subject for in terms of English language writing. So
Mm.
some of those bylines, I've probably picked them up. I mean, partly because there just weren't that many people writing about that stuff.
Right.
So I've been very, very lucky, very fortunate in that regard.
You found the perfect niche before it blew up, but it was still blowing up. Because you arrived in China in what year? 2004, 2005?
2000, yeah, 2005, 2006, I think. Maybe
2005, 2006. Okay, so still the early aughts, but late enough where the internet's kind of strong enough so the we could still kind of communicate cross culturally, and you're writing about China in English to English readers. Did you find in those early years other Westerners writing about it, or was your colleagues Chinese-born English writers as well? Kind of what was the makeup of the office? What did that look like?
So the office for the publications that I was working at, the editorial staff were predominantly European, American, um, American-born people, and then both so the magazine I worked at before Time Out was called SH Magazine,
Mhm.
and then I went to Time Out, um, and I think there was always a strong recognition that there should be Chinese voices in those publications as much as possible as well. But that obviously, well, for some of them at least, there would need to be some editing. I mean, to be honest, there was always a need for editing of native English speakers as well. So, but yeah, I think both publications always made an effort to make sure that Chinese people were employed as well, and that there was an effort to sort of tell some of those stories and or to sort of tell things from their perspective.
Mhm.
I mean, both magazines were city focused magazines, so but I think Time Out, in particular, the editor who sort of founded Time Out Shanghai in English, was always very keen to um, say that it was a magazine about the city that happened to be in English rather than a kind of expat magazine
Mhm.
per se. So it was obviously it was in English language. It was always going to speak to a certain, I guess, subset or like a certain group of people within the city because you had to have a certain level of English to be able to understand it. But it wasn't exclusively for foreigners necessarily. And also, I think even if it was probably a majority foreigner readership, it was still very much the attitude that that kind of gave us in terms of the kinds of stories we wanted to do. We weren't just writing about the international bands who were coming in. We weren't just writing about expat bands, for example, in the music section. We
Mhm.
were really trying to sort of dig into the Chinese scene and speak to Chinese bands and write about them as well, and try and give people, I guess, like a fuller version of what the city was. So yeah, so there was, the colleagues were kind of mixed, I guess, predominantly probably European and American born writers for the most part. But there were other people writing about uh, Chinese music, especially in English, yeah. And I wasn't the first by any means. There was plenty of other people. There's a long line of writers and people there who were there before me, and some of them are still there now. Um, and people who did it far better than me as well. Like, I mean, I would in particular like call out a guy called Josh Viola, who was based in Beijing, and really embedded himself in the kind of Chinese music scene generally, and also is just a fantastic writer, and really did a fantastic job at um, helping bring those kind of Chinese bands into the English language world in terms of bringing them into publications back home. So either in the US or in Europe, I mean, back home in the US for him, but into the English language world a lot more. I think initially, like a lot of my writing was very much focused kind of within China still, even though it was in the English language. But yeah, he did a phenomenal job in kind of making sure that big publications, music publications overseas also sat up and took notice of Chinese bands.
That's so fascinating. That is so fascinating. I'm curious about, so you were at Time Out for years. And for the listeners, he was not just one of the like columnists on Time Out. He eventually became the editor at large at Time Out. And you've been the editor at large for a few different publications, but for Time Out specifically, kind of what was that experience kind of rising within the organization? And when you became editor, what were some of your priorities, or what were some of the goals you wanted to achieve there?
I mean, first and foremost, like those publications are, I mean, they're quite small teams.
Mhm.
So I mean, you say sort of rising through the ranks as if like, but it was, I mean, it was really a handful of people, so it wasn't a sort of huge jump necessarily, I guess. But no,
Very
I mean, I
cool.
was very fortunate to work for a really great editor at Time Out in Toby Skinner, and he taught me a huge amount. And I think probably, I mean, my goals really in taking over were really to just try and continue the great work that he had started. And I think, again, it comes back to that sort of perspective that he really instilled in us from an early day, which was, from the early days, which was it's a city magazine. And it just happens to be in English, and it shouldn't be written in a way. It shouldn't be like, oh, look at this thing; it's a bit weird. It should just you can celebrate the interesting and quirky things that you come across in the city, like you would do if you were working for Time Out London and you'd lived and you know grown up in London all your life. Like Um, and so I think really trying to continue that was a really key part of what I wanted to do when I took over as editor. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was a great gig. Time Out is I mean, it's a brand that I still have a lot of affection for. But the whole point of it was to go and find the best things in the city. It was a monthly magazine at that time, a print magazine. So yeah, basically every month we had to go and find the most interesting, exciting things happening in the city. Which in a city like Shanghai, there's a lot to choose from, and so yeah, I never planned to sort of stay there as long as I did, and to keep doing that job as long as I did. But when your job is to, yeah, go and find all the best things going on in town, it's a hard one to give up, to be honest. It's constantly shifting, it's constantly changing, because it's new stuff, and it's a listings magazine at its heart. So that it really lives and breathes on events and the sort of churn and newness of the city constantly. So yeah, it was a great experience. I loved it.
And while you were at Timeout, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're still writing, maybe independently, maybe for other publications. Um, or kind of break down maybe what that experience was, how you were writing for several different publications, because you're also interviewing local artists as well as Western artists that come to Shanghai. And there's a couple names for the listener that you probably know that Jake has interviewed, including Justin Bieber and I believe Keith Richards, Kanye West. But kind of maybe talk about maybe your favorite interviews, both local Western interviewees, and and more maybe outside of Time Out. What were some of the other publications you enjoyed writing for?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, those interviews were, I mean, the ones you just named were fun.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, we view Kanye in a slightly different light these days, unfortunately. But at the time, it was a really interesting interview. I mean, it was just as 808s and Heartbreaks was coming out. I think
Nice.
it was maybe like a week or two before that album dropped. Um, and it was kind of one of those interviews. It got pushed back. It got pushed back. I mean, we were a small kind of English language magazine. This was actually for SH magazine. This wasn't for Time Out.
Nice.
I think basically what was happening was that his show in Shanghai sales weren't particularly going that well, and I think they kind of just needed the coverage.
Mm.
I mean, otherwise, I don't know why he would have really, even at that stage of his career, why he really would have cared about a small magazine in English in Shanghai. But anyway, we got the interview. They kept pushing it back. It happened sort of in the middle of the night. It was about a sort of 3 a.m. interview or something in the end. And I was just sort of sat there in the office, just by the phone, waiting for his management or whoever to call me. Um, and they eventually called back, and I think he was in Rio at the time. And I kind of just, super softball, like opening question. And I was just like, oh, how's Rio? And he kind of just snapped back with something like, I don't know, because I've been in this hotel room doing media all day, doing press. Like, I'm just looking out the window at it and I want to get out there. And I was like, oh, great. And so, yeah, it was a really awkward start. And he was kind of just going through the motions a little bit, to be honest. Sometimes you get the sense of like people are just rattling off kind of pre-rehearsed answers, or he's just not really there, even though he's got a new album coming out. Again, fair enough. Like, he didn't know who on earth I was or who this publication was. Um, but what I did know was that he had spent time in China as a child.
Yes.
And this wasn't particularly well known, I don't think, at that time. I forget how I'd come across it. I'm sorry, I'm sort of betraying. I should give my sources, but I can't remember who it was. But anyway, I'd found out that his mum had actually taught at Nanjing University, and he had come across with her at the time and spent a bit of time in China as a child. And so I asked him about that, and I was like, how do you feel sort of coming back to China, as it were? And of course, that was something that people would know, no one had really kind of asked him much about. And so he couldn't just rattle off a kind of pre-rehearsed answer for that. He stopped, and he actually just really opened up. And he got really quite emotional because he was talking about how it was a really special time because it was just him and his mum and surrounded by people they didn't know in a kind of environment which they weren't familiar with. And he was talking about how that was a really sort of close time for them. So yeah, so that was a really interesting interview. I mean, Keith Richards was great. Like he's very fun. it was a phone call interview. I mean, a lot of these things, they're phone calls because, the Rolling Stones aren't hanging around in China for a month waiting for you to interview them before they come and play, their one night in Shanghai, one night in Beijing, whatever. But anyway, yeah, I just remember the phone call started and it was kind of one of those ones where someone from his team sort of like kind of is on the line first. And I could just hear him sort of sniggering and chuckling in the way in the background in that sort of, very distinctive Keith Richards voice and clearly making everybody around him laugh. And yeah, he was a lot of fun. But yeah, no, I've been very fortunate to interview a lot of people. And again, I mean, a lot of that is really just right time, right place, right place, right time. I think like if it wasn't for the fact that I worked for a publication in Shanghai and that, those acts were all sort of touring through China at that time, probably wouldn't have interviewed a lot of people that I have done. So yeah, very fortunate to do that. I mean, when I was at Time Out, a lot of my writing and work was very much focused on Time Out, and then as editor in particular, it was kind of a job that you lived really. I mean, because you lived in the city, and I was kind of, I think people sort of used to joke that I was almost always taking notes, even in like sort of bars and restaurants and stuff out, and I was kind of like my long suffering wife would sort of see me sort of taking photos of all the menus when I took her out for dinner and stuff all the time. It was a sort of constant review mode. But yeah, so I kind of probably was very much focused on that. I mean, I forget the timelines and stuff these days, but yeah, writing for other people. Yeah, again, I kind of tried to sort of push myself probably a little bit, especially sort of as my time with Time Out went on, to try and sort of get bylines in other publications.
Mm.
And yeah, sorry, you asked about Chinese bands as well. And I've been very fortunate to interview some really great Chinese bands, and some of them I've sort of become friendly with as well, which is really great. And I could reel off a whole bunch of those, but I feel like I've been talking for quite a long time already. So
No, you're good. This is good. I love this, and we can go in two different directions. One direction, I want to talk a little bit about the bylines you have been able to get. Some publications you may have known. I'm talking to the listener now. Associated Press, Vogue, Financial Times. Kind of talk about how did those opportunities open up for you, and what were some of those articles, and maybe what are one or two that stand out to you in terms of an experience you didn't expect or were really excited to get.
yeah, gosh, that's a good question. I mean, again, in terms of how those opportunities sort of came about, I mean, I think it's probably again just been very very fortunate in that the a lot of the people that I worked with, in particular at Time Out, were very talented writers, editors. A lot of them didn't stay around in Shanghai all that long, especially that sort of first group who kind of helped launch Time Out Shanghai. And a number of them sort of came back to London or went, to other places and went and worked for, some really great publications. And when they needed somebody on the ground in China or especially in Shanghai, I was lucky enough to pop into their minds, I guess. And
Mhm.
so a lot of it has sort of been that and just kind of, yeah, just trying to sort of maintain those contacts and stuff and being very lucky in having sort of people who are more talented and yeah, careers were progressing probably faster than mine and having, friends in the right places. Um, so yeah, a lot of those things kind of came across from that. Yeah, I mean, again, I think again being an English language journalist in China, is I don't know, it's difficult for the really established newspapers, especially these days, actually, to kind of get properly credentialed
Mm.
journalists on the ground there. It's not a particularly welcoming climate for foreign language newspaper journalists in particular. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think also probably just the amount of time that I was there. I think partly people sort of would contact me and say, "Are you still in Shanghai or are you still in China?" And
Mm.
often I was. But also, yeah, just hopefully, I hope that meant that I was able to bring a little bit of context to some of that writing and to some of the pieces that I did as well. And I think one of the things that I found from living there in particular and from writing about it is that it's these days in particular, there's a very sort of clear kind of China bad sort of narrative. Um, and there is plenty about the country that is rightly criticized. But there's, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Like any country, there's plenty to criticize Britain for, frankly. But there's a lot of great things about it as well, and there's a lot of great things about China. And so I think hopefully I sort of try to bring a little bit of nuance and things to some of those pieces, so as honestly as possible.
Mm.
Not trying to cover anything up or sort of lean any one way, but yeah, probably more just luck and sort of being there for a long time, I guess, meant that people kind of got in touch. And yeah, I was people's kind of China contact for a little bit for certain publications, certain friends.
Well, I super appreciate the modesty, Jake, and I will take the time to boast you for a little bit for the listener. But Jake's writing is exceptionally good. And I'm a huge admirer of his work for several reasons. One, I write about music as well, but what Jake has done has kind of crossed the line between independent journalism, and his own brand versus kind of legitimacy within the establishment of the writing landscape in the writing world. And I find that really fascinating because he's also doing this in outside of the Western media sphere, in the Eastern sphere. And as somebody who's spent just one small year in China, I know how tough it is, one, to live there, to learn the culture. I believe you also know the language. You're quite fluent in Mandarin, which is a whole nother conversation we could talk about, and getting respect within that space as a writer. And so I just want to give you that kudos before I ask my next question, because it is exceptional, and I want the listener to recognize everything that you're describing. He's describing it very well, but I want to just give you a little bit of like, and that he's a gem in the space. He is not an ordinary writer. Luck is part of it, but it's not all of it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I had to do that. So the next question is actually about your Substack. So Concrete Avalanche, and maybe take us a little bit maybe outside post time out. What was that time like for you? And and why did you decide to write for Substack? What was that decision like for you? And how has your experience been on the platform?
Yeah. So I mean, post time out was probably when I sort of picked up a few more of those kind of like of other bylines in other publications. I kind of decided to. I mean, I'd been at Time Out for quite a few years, and I had really sort of taken it as far as I could, and so I kind of decided to go freelance for a little bit. I carried on doing a little bit of stuff with Time Out, which is how I kind of picked up that editor at large title for a little while. Um, but yeah, and then after that, I wrote for another sort of China-focused English language publication called Radii. I did that for a few years, and then sort of same story again. I kind of decided to go freelance after a few years there as well. And the Substack really kind of came about in that sort of second phase. So um, uh, some people that I knew had set up a Substack called Chaoyang Trap.
Mhm.
Um, in particular, a guy called Krish Raghav, who's really talented. I mean, actually, he's really talented at all sorts of things. I won't list all of them now, but in particular, like really talented illustrator and writer. He'd been based in Beijing for a long time in the district of Chaoyang, which is hence the name Chaoyang Trap. And they put together what I thought at the time was a newsletter. I kind of found out later on that it was a Substack and sort of learned more about Substack probably through that, really. Really smart group of people, really nice kind of diverse mixture of voices, just doing like incredibly smart deep dives on topics around China and actually really in areas that weren't getting exposure in the English language again. And they just did it. They did it fantastically well. I was lucky enough to write for them once, and I think it was almost like their last issue. So I hope I didn't, I hope I wasn't a nail in the coffin or something. But yeah, I was. Chris asked me to write a music piece for them, a short music piece. And yeah, I think that was probably when I sort of became aware of Substack as a platform. And actually, I think they had launched Chaoyang Trap just around about the time that I was going freelance for the second time after Radii.
Mm.
And I had sort of thought of starting my own kind of newsletter or something. Maybe I think at one point I'd sort of toyed with the idea of like a podcast with a Chinese colleague of mine, Radii. And then Chang Trap launched, and I was like, oh, this is really really good. I can't live up to this. I can't no way. Um, but yeah, when Chang Trap um, when they kind of hung up their keyboard or whatever it was, I guess when they sort of finished that, um, yeah, I don't know, maybe that was the spark a little bit as well. I was like, okay, maybe I was never going to live up to what they were doing, but I'd become familiar with the platform. Um, I knew that I wanted to carry on writing about music in China, even if people weren't necessarily paying me to do it. Um, and I was still living in the country. I was in Fujian at that time. I was in a small village in Fujian,
Mhm.
and yeah, I mean, I still spent, and I mean, it's true today as well. Like I spend way too much time digging into like sort of Chinese music on the internet, and I was always going to gigs. Even though we were living in a small village in Fujian, we would travel regularly to go and sort of see live music, to go to music festivals. I was trying to sort of indoctrinate like my nephew into rock and roll music and stuff, and trying to take him to music festivals and gigs and things like that. Um, and yeah, just a huge amount of my time and just interest, frankly, was consumed by all of that. So I kind of thought, well, I should probably have an outlet, and it kept me busy as well when I was a freelancer. And sometimes as a freelancer, you're sort of sat there, kind of wondering, like, why is nobody giving me any work? Where's the next paycheck coming from? All that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, at least if I'm sort of writing about obscure Chinese bands, it keeps me busy for a little bit. So yeah, so that was probably where all of that started. A little bit as well. I mean, there were more sort of serious reasons, I suppose, behind it a little bit as well. In that, um, I do think and continue to think that Chinese music doesn't get the coverage that it ought to in the English language sphere. Again, like Josh Fiola has done a great job in sort of getting bylines in international magazines and really bringing that to the fore. But still, there's little pockets of it here and there, but it's still doesn't get a lot of coverage. And in particular, in sort of mainstream kind of like newspapers, like I've pitched articles before to some of them and have been asked whether the band will, for example, say something controversial about the government or about, I mean, COVID or something like that. And I get it. I do understand where they're coming from, but I also wonder if they make that same ask of a band who's from Manchester or from Brooklyn or wherever. It's like, um, yeah. So I think partly I kind of started it because of that. Substack also had the very first Substacker, I think, is Bill Bishop, who writes a really excellent newsletter about Chinese politics, and sort of Chinese life. Uh, and so, yeah, I guess there were people who were there who I was already reading were on that platform. So it seemed like a kind of natural place to test it out and just see whether anybody would care about me writing about obscure Chinese bands. I mean, they're not obscure actually. They're not obscure in China, but in the English language world, they are considered obscure, obviously. So yeah, that's how it came about.
Outstanding. And you did do it. Like when you made the Substack, there clearly has been an audience for it. I believe you have almost 3,000 subscribers. You've been awarded the featured publication for 2023, which is a follower subscriber like accolade one gets on Substack. And so for the listener who are unfamiliar with Jake's work, like he is making an impact and he does have a presence, I should say, on Substack, which is significant, especially amongst the music writers. And I 100% kind of want to concur what you said about even when it comes to Asia music, the Western media has a preference clearly for music out of Seoul or music out of Tokyo versus music out of Beijing or Shanghai, or let alone Chengdu or any Shenzhen, people really cities within China that have just as big of a population, just as big as a followership. It's really I see it as like you're describing Western bias towards certain cities. And it's very interesting what you noted about maybe if you can get attention, we need you to say certain things, or maybe if you want to say certain things, we'd love for you to say certain things. Um, and so that's very profound. I want to credit you also for putting me onto so many Chinese bands, and I try to share as many as I can. Like this week at work, I was telling folks about my obsession with Chinese football, I believe. So thank you for that. I wanted to thank you in person or virtually. A great band. Never heard of them prior to reading your Substack. So I'm now digging into like where they're from, how did they grow in the 90s, how because they're getting Western attention bit by bit, and so that's been really cool.
Oh, yeah. They're getting it under their own steam as well. I
Yeah.
mean, they're a really hardworking band, and they've sort of taken a slightly different route to it. But I mean, they're one who, I mean, yeah, they just did a tour of like North America,
So
uh,
cool.
and they were selling out venues. Like, I mean, they did, you know, a lot of stops. It wasn't like they just played sort of one or two cities. They did a lot of stops all like across the US and Canada. They sold out, I think, most, yeah, it's at least the majority, if not all of those shows. And the audience, I mean, rightly, they love them. I mean, they are, yeah. I'm really glad that you highlighted them. I'm really glad that you enjoy their music. They're just, yeah, they're a band who, I don't know, it's hard not to love, and it's really great
Yeah.
to see them doing well and getting that audience. So.
No, they're incredible. I need to write. I haven't written about it yet, so I need to figure out a way what I want to like. I've been listening to the audio tree that dropped recently. That's been really fun. Um, but they have just a lot of good albums. Okay, so next question is, so I call these the if ever you're listening questions. My Substack is called If Ever You're Listening. This podcast is called If Ever You're Listening. And these are general questions I ask all the interviewees, or I should say the style of them is the same. I have to be very specific, I think, for you because of the background and what you write about versus maybe other American-based writers or European-based writers. So but this first question I think will be no, it's not going to be general at all. But it's more about music you're listening to and stuff like that, and tips for other writers, because a lot of the readers and the listeners for my publication are early stage musicians, budding music journalists, folks that are interested in online content space, whether that's visual or written. And so I try to talk with musicians with experience who can give some tips as well as other writers. And so that's kind of the theme before I ask the specific question. So the first one is about um, the year looking forward for 2025, and so from your perspective, the typical question I ask is what are you listening to, but I want to ask you what are some Chinese bands and artists that folks should be listening to in 2025, minus Chinese football, which I think is one of them.
Yeah, yeah, you took that one off my list straight away. Gosh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, as much as I spend a huge amount of time sort of digging into Chinese music and everything else, like I still find it a little bit tricky to get a handle on what's in the pipeline. So
Mm,
I sort of find out about new releases pretty much when the fans do as well. I mean, I'm a fan. There's a handful, I mean, well, really only like two or three, maybe kind of labels or artists maybe who would sort of actually get in touch and tell me when
mhm.
something's coming. But yeah, so it's really difficult for me. I'm always a little bit in awe of those kind of like 2025 preview lists for other people. Like, I mean, I would love to do something like that. Although I guess to my audience, I don't know whether it would even mean that much. But anyway, it's a very long-winded way of saying like I don't know. I don't know what's going to be coming up in the pipeline. I can tell you what just came out and what you
Yeah.
should be listening to. It's in the newsletter as well. But yeah, I don't know. I would hope that. I mean, I can sort of make a few general guesses, I suppose. Like one, I would really hope that a band called High Person, who are a Chengdu post-punk band, I really hope that they have a new album out. Feels like it's sort of been in the works for a little while. Their last album, Bildungsroman, I'm probably really butchering the pronunciation of that. I don't speak German. is was a really great album, and really kind of they'd been sort of there or thereabouts for a little while. They'd definitely been building up a following. I think that album took them to a new level. Uh, I hope they've got a follow up coming soon. We'll see. Um, Sleeping Dogs are a really great Chinese band out of Beijing. They You would not know that they were Chinese when you listen to them. I feel like, I mean, a lot of these bands maybe they shatter your perceptions of what a Chinese band is. They take influences from all over the world, in particular kind of like Latin rhythms. More recently, Afrobeat, like Fela Kuti kind of style stuff. Like really great percussion, really talented musicians, and they have sort of tended to release kind of EPs more. They did have a full length album out, I think maybe 2 years ago now, called Blunt Razor. But generally, they sort of tend to put out kind of 3 or 4 track EPs fairly regularly. So I would hope they would be one more at least this year. They just will put one out kind of late last year. Um, yeah, gosh, I don't know who else really. We'll see. I mean, it's kind of not really end of year yet in China as well. That's the other thing you kind of got to
Yeah,
remember. So
true.
it's Lunar New Year in a couple of weeks, and so the kind of all the sort of end of year stuff is kind of happening now, and there's not too much yet in terms of kind of like looking forward or like what's coming in the next year. But yeah, I mean, subscribe to Concrete Avalanche. I'll keep you posted, I guess.
Subscribe. We should be saying that more. Subscribe to Concrete Avalanche. I'm gonna say that after post questions. But yeah, so for the average listener, you most of you are from Europe or the United States. So right now in China, it's like November. Like it's about to be the end of the year, maybe even October. And so I guess you could talk about it, but and the long and short of it is there's kind of two end of the year months they call Lunar New Year, where folks are traveling and going back to their families from school or their work. And that was when I took advantage I was teaching at a university in Shenyang, and that's when I went to Xi'an and Kunming and Dali and Shanghai. I was trying to see as much as China as possible before I had to go back to work. But I didn't know I had that much time. I thought I had like 2, 3 weeks. They're like, no, it's like 2 months. So that's kind of the background of what Jake is saying. So in October, November, we don't know who the end of the year lists are going to be or what. So that's why that makes sense. I didn't even think of that. That's a good point. My next question is about your work specifically and your articles and your essays. And we actually didn't talk too deeply about your specific articles and essays, so maybe this question could address that. But um, what are some of your most maybe in your eyes, what are some are underappreciated or underrated articles or essays you've written that you want to highlight or spotlight for folks to check out, maybe post this interview?
Gosh. I mean, I'm appreciative of any reads on anything that I write about. I'm very conscious that I, yeah, I'm writing about stuff which not a lot of people write about in English. Not in a sort of grandiose way, but just in I recognize it can be a difficult subject to get into sometimes. Which is why, I very much focus on making sure that all of the music I write about is available on like Western platforms, for example. And I try and make it as easy as possible for people to kind of just click play and listen to the music. But I mean, in terms of pieces that I'm like particularly proud of, I suppose I was really pleased to write for The Wire, which is a music publication which I hold in very high regard, and I just love what they do. I don't understand all of it. I think they're one of those magazines where you kind of like I look at some of the cover stars even sometimes, and I'm like I have no idea who these people are, and I love that about them actually. I love that they really stick to it, and they do their thing. And I was fortunate enough to write about Hualun, who are one of my favorite Chinese bands, and I wrote about them for The Wire, and yeah, was just felt very, very privileged to have been able to do that. And also in part, I mean, partly because I love Hualun as a band, but also because I think they actually sort of made the joke, or kind of we talked about this right at the start when I first kind of spoke to them about how I think that we'd sort of followed each other online for like quite a long time, but I'd never actually interviewed them, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm.
And so it was really great to like actually sit there, do like a proper kind of interview with them. They're really lovely people. they were very generous with their time, really pleased. And also they were, I mean, they're proper like music fans and everything else as well. They were very excited to be featured in a magazine like The Wire. Um, so yeah, I don't think it was underappreciated because I think, it was in The Wire, and I think that readership is really open-minded and everything else. But yeah, that would be a piece that I'm particularly proud of. Um, yeah, another piece. So just really quickly is like it's actually it did kind of, again. I'm appreciative of any numbers on any of these pieces, but a piece that I did on Substack was with a writer called M, who writes this really great newsletter called Active Faults, which is kind of much more about the mainstream Chinese entertainment sphere, not
Mhm.
just music, but entertainment more broadly. Uh, she's incredibly clever and a really great writer and just really, really insightful. And I strongly recommend her newsletter. And I was fortunate enough to do a sort of collaboration with her about a sort of mainstream kind of pop idol-ish TV show, which was particularly focused on rock music and how it kind of brought these previously underground rock bands very quickly into the mainstream Chinese media kind of spotlight. And so her and I kind of did a little collaboration around that show, and I really enjoyed working with her. Yeah, I think it's I don't know. To me, that was a really interesting piece. I mean, largely because of her comments rather than mine, but yeah, I've been working on that.
For the listener, we're gonna drop these three articles in the when I release this, because I want you guys to be able to have access to them and see them. And selfishly, I really want to read these because I don't think I've read the interview with Wallen, I believe. Or I've seen you writing about them. I don't maybe I didn't see The Wired, but the other two sound really, really cool, and I would love to check those out. Um, Thank you for sharing that, Jake. For my third question and my second to last question is, so kind of context for the listener when this comes out. It'll probably be over by then, but maybe we'll still be in the mix of it. But we just learned in America, the Supreme Court is going to uphold the ban on TikTok. And I think that's a very like timely subject. So we're gonna have to try to maybe dance around it about kind of the Western and Eastern divide, the digital divide, kind of the Great Wall, as some would called it in the 90s and early 2000s, and it kind of never ended. We're still in it in terms of digital divide. And Jake, I would love to hear your thoughts on this because you seem to be like one of the ones that are breaking through in terms of we know you in the West, they know you in the East, but there's respect on both sides, and there isn't as much tension. But for you, if there is anything, maybe legally, you could do. I ask Americans when I interview them, what is something about the American music industry you'd want to change for the artist or for the writer? But for you, I'm curious, maybe what are some of the things that you wish can change about the communication between the Eastern music industry and the Chinese music industry and the Western music industry?
That's a really great question. Wow, yeah, I kind of wish I had time to think about this a little bit more. But I mean, straight off the top of my head, I mean, it's not. I don't know if it really counts as a sort of music industry to music industry thing. I mean, I really wish like Bandcamp was unblocked in that country.
Mhm.
Like it got blocked a few years ago. I mean, and bands still upload to it. They still find a way. Chinese people are very good at finding a way through the various barriers that sometimes come up in their lives. Um, but yeah, I wish it wasn't. I think Bandcamp's a really great platform, and I would, I always try and sort of promote links on Bandcamp over any other platform because they actually do give artists, well, relatively, they give artists a reasonable share of the money. And I think it's a really great discovery platform as well for a lot of artists. But yeah, in terms of like, gosh, like music, I mean, I think I wish the sort of Western, the European, North American kind of music industry would sort of try and take the time to kind of build bridges and understand a little bit more about what's going on in China and also about the Chinese artists who are there and think about how they could potentially bring them to other audiences if they want to do that rather than I think, I mean, just generally with a lot of businesses, there's always been this sense that for a long time that China was just this huge market to be exploited. That's that's how capitalism works. But uh, I think there's more that you can do to sort of, particularly with these kind of artists, kind of artists that I write about as well, to really sort of support them and help them build up what they're doing. But I also think it would be naive to assume that those artists necessarily want to break through in the West. Maybe some of them don't. Like there is a very big market in China ultimately. Not that you should necessarily go in there with an exploitative attitude, but I mean, we're talking about over 1 billion people. Not all of those people are necessarily going to be, well, yeah, they're certainly not listening to like rock music or alternative music in a sense, but like, there's a market there. There's an audience there. And so maybe for a lot of those artists and bands, they're not really that bothered about getting fans elsewhere. But I think, you've seen with like a band like Chinese Football, who it was a dream for them to play outside of China, and then they did that a few years back. But to go outside of Asia was a really big dream, and to come, play in the US in particular was I think really eye opening for them, and just to see audiences there who were really responding to their music was a great experience for them. And so, yeah, I would love to sort of see more of that happen. I think around about 2008 or so, kind of in the run up to the Beijing Olympics, there was a lot more of this sort of thing happening. Like I think
Yeah.
maybe Mars, which is a Beijing-based label, was doing a lot of work in terms of bringing Chinese bands to Europe and to the US. Modern Sky did a little bit of that as well, who are also like another big label in China. I've just seen actually in the last few days that Modern Sky is going to do a festival in Japan this
Oh,
year.
nice.
They did a festival in New York, I think, like years ago.
Oh.
But a lot of this is like, I don't know, it's a little bit sporadic, and I think often it's kind of like trying to get bands into things like South by Southwest and stuff, which maybe it has an impact, but yeah, I don't know. I wish there was a bit more. I mean, just generally, I think person to person exchange, just generally between the US and China, or China and the West, would be beneficial in a lot of areas. Not necessarily just music, but yeah, that was a slightly meandering answer. I don't think if I really kind of got to a point there, but yeah, that
No,
was
you did, and I think you kind of made a period to it at the end where you said it's really the person to person connection, because that was really the through line of what you were saying. All of these are different ways that people in the West could learn more about artists in the East, and vice versa. It would be great if some Western artists actually did a tour throughout China, not just in Shanghai. We kind of saw that with Kanye this past year when he was in the south of China, and he did a couple shows, and they had some really good numbers. And I would love to see a lot more artists do that. So
Yeah, I agree. And to be fair, like there have been attempts at that, and there were people doing that as well. I think especially pre-COVID. I think COVID kind of like really, I mean, COVID and the sort of more broader kind of like geopolitical climate has probably put the dampeners on a lot of that.
Mhm.
But there was a sort of China-based promoters in particular called Splitworks, who did a lot of work in terms of bringing kind of international, like non-Chinese artists over into China and taking them to places beyond just Beijing and Shanghai. People like Rolling Stones,
Mhm.
Justin Bieber, those kind of artists were playing the big arenas. And to them, like, someone like Taylor Swift comes in and she has a show which just goes into an arena, and it's an arena wherever it is in the world, and it's very impressive. Like it's really good, but Splitworks was very much trying to take artists and help them see the country a little bit more, but also really taking them out to other cities, other parts of the country. And there was an audience there for a lot of it. The economics of that has probably shifted quite a lot. And I think post-COVID in particular, and again with the geopolitical context, it's probably a bit of a hard to sell these days.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think there was a lot of great stuff that came out of that when they were doing those kind of tours. So
That's a really good initiative to spotlight. That's a really good initiative, especially if that ends up returning, hopefully one day. I could see that. That could be one of the tools that's used. Very cool. And I just learned a bunch of new things through that answer. And I have to see if Modern Sky ever does a new New York festival. That would be nice. or
Yeah, we'll
or go
see.
to Japan to go to that list. Or
Yeah.
go to Japan. So thank you so much, Jake. My last question, kind of my roundabout, my full-fledged, my bird's eye view question for your experience is actually something you've been told, not something from you. So my last question is, throughout your career, what has been the best advice you've been given? And why was it the best advice you've been given?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, again, I've been very fortunate to work with some really great editors. I mean, I think probably maybe not necessarily kind of direct advice almost, but I think having my work edited by other people has been a really eye-opening experience. And I think as much as I kind of now just put my stuff out into the ether and it just kind of goes off on Substack, like I think I probably wouldn't write in exactly the way that I do write if I hadn't had that experience of working with some really great editors and also just other writers as well. You know, I think you just reading other people's work. When I was at SH magazine, there was a really talented writer called Christopher St. Cavish, who was like primarily writing about food, but he was also actually really had a real passion for music. Just a really talented writer, really great guy, and I learned a lot by just kind of seeing him work and reading his pieces. Um, Again, like Toby Skinner at Time Out, I think just seeing the way that he edited um, my work and the way that he would really sort of pull through the sort of stories that I want to tell was really beneficial to me. Um, and I feel like maybe this is something he told me, but it was kind of especially for a magazine like Time Out, you've gone off and you've experienced something,
Mm.
um, and when you come back, and I feel like he once told me, you know, the thing that you tell someone when they say, "How was it?" the first thing that you say back to them, that should be pretty much how you open your article
Mm.
because that's the thing that really stuck in your mind. That's the aspect of it that really spoke to you and that really and it's probably going to be the thing that will pull the reader in as well. And it's not like a hard and fast rule. Obviously, you know, the conversations you have with people depend on context, all of that kind of stuff. But I think just generally, that was actually a piece of advice that I probably stole and passed on to other writers as well. When they were really struggling with like how to start a piece, was like, what's the one thing, you know, what would you tell me if we were talking about it right now? Like, how would you just start talking about it? And maybe start there, and maybe you go back and you delete that and you edit it and you write it, but just as a way into a piece when you're sort of really struggling to write. I don't know. That's always something which kind of pops back in my mind.
That's phenomenal advice and it's actionable. I think that's great for the listeners to hear and that's something I'll definitely take into consideration when I write about concerts I go to or different festivals and stuff like that or even after maybe like interviews like this. I go like, how was that interview? That was a really good interview. Um, Thank you so much, Jake. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Newby, we appreciate you so much for coming to the If Ever You're Listening podcast. Everybody, please follow Jake on all the things. Jake, actually, where can people get your stuff?
Um, yeah, on Substack. So, I mean, I guess probably search for Concrete Avalanche or Concrete Avalanche Chinese music. It's named after a song. So if the song comes up, play the song as well because it's a really great song by a Chinese band called Lava Oxy. But yeah, hopefully, if you scroll down enough on Google, you'll find the newsletter as well. And it's free. It's completely free. You know, there's no paywall for this because it's not stuff that people are necessarily finding elsewhere. So yeah, sign up there. I'm not on a lot of social media these days, but yeah, that newsletter goes out as regularly as I can make it, usually once every 2 weeks.
And once you start, you'll never go back. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good rest of your day, Jake.
Thanks so much, Stanley.